The Peephole Stalker. Julia Reeds had always thought of herself as cautious, maybe even a little paranoid. But after the divorce, that caution felt like armor. At 30 years old, living alone for the first time in a decade, she embraced her solitude in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Wichita, Kansas. The building wasn't fancy, just a 4-story brick structure with creaky stairs and a perpetually flickering hallway light, but it felt like a clean slate. The landlord, a kind man in his 60s, assured her that the neighborhood was safe. The peephole in her front door was something she noticed on her first night. It was scratched, not deeply, but enough to distort her view of the hallway. She'd squinted through it, laughing at how the warped glass turned the dim corridor into a kaleidoscope. It didn't seem worth complaining about, just one of those quirks of older buildings. Julia's routine settled quickly. Mornings began with coffee from the cafe down the block. Afternoons were filled with freelance design projects, and evenings were hers to unwind. Wichita's quiet pace suited her. She liked the sound of crickets outside her window at night and the way the sun filtered through her sheer curtains in the morning. But things began to change after her second week. The sensation was subtle at first, an unease she couldn't quite place. She felt it most often in the evenings, when the quiet of her apartment stretched thin. Sitting at her desk or lounging on the couch, she'd catch herself glancing at the peephole, as though expecting to see a shadow on the other side. There was never anything there, but the feeling persisted, a tickle at the edge of her senses, like being watched from a distance. The first note appeared on a Thursday. Julia was running late for an errand and nearly missed the folded piece of paper tucked under her doormat. Its jagged handwriting stopped her cold. "You look beautiful when you sleep." Her heart hammered as she turned the note over, finding no signature. She tried to brush it off. A prank, maybe? Some neighbor with a bad sense of humor. But that night, the unease deepened. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally in the corners of her apartment. When she finally went to bed, her sleep was fitful, interrupted by the feeling that she wasn't alone. Julia tried to rationalize the note. It had to be a joke. Maybe one of her neighbors had noticed her coming and going at odd hours, or catching glimpses of her through the blinds. But the more she thought about it, the more it unsettled her. Who would write something like that? And how did they know she slept in the first place? The next few days passed without incident, but the tension never left her. Each time she entered her apartment, she'd glance at the peephole. The door seemed to grow larger, more imposing. It felt as if the hallway outside had grown darker, and she couldn't shake the sensation that someone might be standing just on the other side, watching her. Then the second note arrived. This one was left on her doorstep, even more chilling than the first. It read, "I watch you every night. You can't escape me." The handwriting was the same, uneven, like the person writing it was in a hurry or hiding. Julia's stomach twisted, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. She had no doubt that this was no prank. Whoever was leaving these notes was watching her. She tried to ignore the fear creeping into her chest. She reminded herself that it could be anyone. A neighbor, someone who had an unhealthy interest in her, but no one she knew personally. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her. The thought of checking the peephole made her heart race, but she had to. She had to know if there was someone out there. One night, after she finished her late-night work, she decided to take a peek. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the hallway outside was dimly lit. Her hand trembled slightly as she approached the door. She hesitated for just a moment before looking through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Relief flooded her, but just as quickly, it was replaced by an eerie sense of dread. Had she imagined it? Was there truly no one there, or was someone standing just out of view, waiting for her to look away? That night, as Julia lay in bed, she heard something. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from the hallway. She froze, straining to hear. There was no mistaking it. Someone was outside her door, lightly tapping on it, just enough to make her think she was hearing things, but not enough to confirm it. It felt deliberate, as if whoever was out there was testing her patience, waiting for her to open the door. Her breath caught in her throat. She dared not move. Julia lay motionless in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. The scratching sound continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. She listened intently, but the silence that followed only made the moment feel heavier, suffocating. Slowly, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it and pulled up her contacts. Her first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but she quickly stopped herself. Who would she call? Her friends? Her family? How could she explain this without sounding paranoid? She didn't want to seem like the kind of person who overreacted. And yet, deep down, she knew something was wrong. Finally, she clicked on her phone's camera app. Maybe, just maybe, there was something in the hallway that she could catch with a quick glance. She took a deep breath and, despite the wave of panic rising in her throat, opened her door just enough to slip the phone's camera outside. She pressed record, hoping to capture something, anything, that would explain the unsettling feeling gnawing at her. For a moment, the hallway seemed completely normal. The dim lighting cast long shadows, but there was no one in sight. Julia stood frozen, phone in hand, the camera still rolling. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, her skin crawling as she waited for something, anything to happen. Then, the door across the hall opened slowly, revealing an older man she didn't recognize. He wasn't someone she had ever seen before. His eyes locked onto hers, his face expressionless, and before she could react, he slammed the door shut with a force that rattled the walls. Julia stumbled back, heart racing, feeling the blood drain from her face. She hadn't seen him before, and yet the look he gave her was filled with something she couldn't quite place. An eerie knowing. Her first instinct was to confront him, to demand what he was doing there, but her body refused to move. She could feel her legs shaking beneath her, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Who was that man, and why had he been watching her? Julia's hand trembled as she lowered the phone from her face. She needed to make sense of what had just happened. The man, the one she had never seen before, was standing in the hall in her building, watching her. It wasn't just the intrusion. It was the way he had looked at her. His stare was cold, calculating. It made her feel like he knew something she didn't. She had to know who he was. With no other options in mind, she decided to go downstairs to the building's management office. Maybe someone there would know about him. She quickly changed into a hoodie and leggings, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that still clung to her. Her apartment was on the 5th floor, and the elevator felt like it took an eternity to reach the ground floor. She couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, her nerves on edge, but the hallway remained empty. When she reached the office, the door was locked. No surprise, since it was late, but Julia could see the light on inside. She knocked hesitantly. A few seconds later, a man in his late 50s with graying hair opened the door. He looked like someone who had worked at the building for years, tired but friendly enough. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice soft but tired. Julia hesitated for a moment, unsure how to begin. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I think I saw someone on the floor who shouldn't be there. A man. He was in the hallway, and I've never seen him before." The man raised an eyebrow. "A man? Are you sure?" She nodded. "Yes. I saw him standing in the hall, and then he just disappeared. I thought maybe he was a new tenant or someone visiting, but I don't know him." The building manager looked at her carefully, clearly sizing her up. "I can assure you, no one should be on your floor that doesn't belong there. We've had no new tenants recently, and no one's come by for any maintenance work." Julia's heart sank. "So, he wasn't supposed to be there?" "No, and that's a concern. I'll take a look around, but it's probably just a misunderstanding," the manager said, giving her a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't seem convinced either. Julia tried to shake off the nagging feeling that had settled in her chest as she left the building manager's office. She'd always been the type to trust her instincts, and something about the whole situation didn't sit right. The man, the way he looked at her, there was something off. Maybe it was just paranoia, a side effect of living alone and recently going through a messy divorce. Still, the fear lingered, gnawing at her every thought. She made her way back to the elevator, pressing the button for the 5th floor. The ride up felt slower than usual, as if time itself were dragging its feet. When the door finally opened, she half expected to see him there, waiting. But the hallway was empty. Just the usual fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Julia took a deep breath and walked down the corridor to her apartment, trying to appear calm. Her key fumbled in her hand, and for a second, she thought she heard footsteps behind her. She froze, but when she turned around, the hallway was still empty, just the soft hum of the building's old pipes. She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding and finally unlocked her door, stepping inside. Once the door clicked shut behind her, the sense of safety didn't quite settle in. She walked across the small living room and dropped her purse on the couch. The apartment was cozy, with an airy feel to it, but tonight it felt like a cage. She went to the window and pulled the blinds up slightly. Looking out, she could see the streetlights flickering faintly. The night was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. That was when she saw it. At the far end of the street, a figure stood near the lamppost, watching. The shape was dark against the light, its features obscured. But the moment she saw it, the figure straightened as though aware of her gaze. A cold chill ran down her spine. Julia stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. She tried to tell herself it was just a coincidence, that it was someone waiting for a bus or a neighbor returning home late. But the way the figure stood, unmoving and silent, felt deliberate. It was him. Julia's breath hitched as she backed away from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure hadn't moved, still standing there, silent and unmoving, beneath the dim streetlight. Every rational part of her mind told her it was nothing, just a stranger on the street, a coincidence. But that nagging fear, the one she had tried so hard to dismiss, crept up again. She turned away from the window and quickly moved to lock the door, double-checking it out of habit. Then, she closed the blinds tightly, blocking out the street entirely. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the events of the day. The strange conversations with the building manager, the lingering feeling she was being watched, and now the figure outside. Everything felt connected. But to what? As she walked back into the living room, she heard something faint, a soft scratching sound, almost imperceptible. Julia froze. Her eyes darted toward the apartment door, but it was still closed, locked. She moved toward the hallway and listened again. The noise came from deeper inside the apartment, from the direction of her bedroom. Her stomach churned. No one had come in. The thought of someone being in there, hiding, sent a jolt of terror through her. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone, unlocking it, and quickly dialing 911. She knew she shouldn't waste time, that if someone was in her apartment, she had to act fast. The dispatcher's voice was calm, assuring her that help was on the way. But Julia could barely focus on the conversation. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound in the silence, felt like an impending threat. After what felt like an eternity, the door to her bedroom creaked open slowly. The air in the apartment seemed to freeze. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, waiting for the next sound, but nothing came. Then, as if to confirm her worst fear, she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching her from behind. Julia's breath caught in her throat as the footsteps grew closer, each one sending a shockwave of panic through her chest. She could feel her heart pounding, her muscles frozen in fear. There was no way she could move fast enough to reach the door, and no way to fight whatever it was that was creeping toward her. The footsteps stopped just behind her. She could feel a presence, an overwhelming weight of something, or someone, too close. Slowly, she turned around. Her eyes locked onto a shadowy figure standing just in the dim light of the hallway, its form barely visible. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a vague silhouette that felt all too familiar. "Who are you?" Julia's voice trembled as she whispered, barely daring to break the silence that seemed to suffocate the room. Her hands shook violently, but she gripped the phone in her palm, ready to call out for help the moment she could. The figure remained motionless. Then, without a word, it took a slow step forward. The atmosphere thickened, the air turning heavy as if the space between them was filled with a palpable, suffocating tension. Julia could almost hear her own pulse in her ears, a high-pitched thudding that made everything feel surreal. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Julia jumped at the sound, the noise like a signal that broke the eerie stillness of the moment. For a split second, the figure seemed to hesitate, its head tilting as if considering whether to advance or retreat. The knock at the door came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, one that sounded distant, but still familiar. "Julia? It's me. Open up. I saw him." The voice was her friend, Tara. Julia's breath rushed out in a mix of relief and confusion. Was Tara talking about the man in the hallway? But before she could react, the figure turned abruptly and disappeared into the shadows of the apartment. Julia's mind raced. The mystery was far from over, and as Tara's voice grew more insistent from outside, Julia knew she had to face whatever was hiding in the darkness. She wasn't alone, but the danger was far from gone. Julia's heart pounded in her chest as she rushed to the door, hands trembling as she reached for the handle. Tara's voice on the other side was frantic, desperate. "Julia, let me in, please!" She swung the door open quickly, expecting to see her friend standing there, but instead, the hallway was empty. There was no sign of Tara, only the dim glow of the hallway light casting long, unsettling shadows across the floor. Julia's pulse quickened as the door creaked open, the air in the apartment now feeling unnervingly cold. "Tara?" she called, stepping cautiously into the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the old wooden floors. Suddenly, the light flickered, casting the hallway into a temporary darkness. Julia's heart nearly skipped a beat, and she spun around, looking behind her. The faintest of movements caught her eye. Just at the corner of the hallway, a shadow shifted. It was him, the man. Julia froze, her mind racing. The figure, now fully visible, stood tall and silent in the middle of the hallway. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she watched him move slowly towards her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. It felt like she was paralyzed, unable to tear her gaze away from the man in front of her. His presence was suffocating, like the air had thickened around him, making it harder to breathe. "Who are you?" Julia finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. Julia's instincts screamed at her to run, but something in her couldn't resist. She took the envelope with shaking hands, the chill of the paper seeping into her skin. As soon as she touched it, the man stepped back into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Julia stood there for a moment, frozen, holding the envelope in her hand. She had no idea what it meant, but she knew one thing. This wasn't over. She ripped the envelope open with trembling fingers, pulling out a single piece of paper. The words scrawled across it were simple, chilling. "I see you. I always will." The door slammed shut behind her,